my vlog where I talk about all the things I love about sewing. So today's video is a tutorial video, and I have been talking about doing this video for a very long time, so my apologies to you all. I think it was for my 3,000 subscribers and I almost get to 4,000, so I'm absolutely so pleased about that. And if you haven't pressed subscribe already and you do like today's video, please do that and give me a thumbs up. So today's tutorial, you will need to get hold of a copy of this book. So it's called Little Bags and Purses and it's by Saskia Abel. And I'll put a link in the drop down box below for where you can get hold of that. Basically, I think I bought my copy on Amazon. It was really easy to get hold of. And the bags that I made came about because of a previous video where I tried to turn my stash into cash. So I made a set of makeup bags for a school fair to try and make a bit of extra money during my week's annual leave. I'll pop a link to that video above. So this is the bag. You can see it's got lovely Rickrack trim and it's got swans on the inside. And I plan to give this little makeup bag away to one lucky person as my way of saying thank you. So if you guys don't win this makeup bag, you can watch a tutorial and make yourself one. Okay, I'd just like to also add a disclaimer. I have no affiliation with Saskia Abel. I bought this book myself. I am not by any means a professional seamstress, and apart from being taught by my mum and self-taught, I'm not professing to be any sort of an expert. So I just thought I'd say that. I hope you enjoy the tutorial and I'll see you at the end. So to make this really cute makeup bag from this book, Little Bags and Purses by Saskia Abel, on page 50, you are going to need the following things. The pattern, so in the back of the book all the pattern pieces are there, so you can just trace them off onto tracing paper, but I've made some nice sturdy card ones because I've made this bag quite a lot of times now, so it's nice to have something that's going to last. And you can see it's quite simple, there's just the main body of the bag and the bag flap. You're also going to need to choose some fabrics, so I've gone for this really beautiful swan print, which is like a quilting cotton, and this is leftover fabric from my Ogden cami that I made recently, so not a scrap of that fabric went to waste, which is really nice. You're also going to need to choose something for the outer of the bag. So I've gone here for a really nice sort of indigo denim, and this actually was a wrap skirt that I've cut up that I no longer wear, so it's proper recycling at its best. And then you're going to need to cut out the flap pieces. So the flap consists of the lining piece, and then what I've done is I've cut a piece of iron-on interfacing, which is a medium weight, and just iron that to the wrong side of the lining piece because this fabric, I don't want the snap to pull through, so I've interfaced this fabric just to make absolutely certain I'm not going to have any issues with my snap. You also need the outer piece of the flap, and for the entire bag we need some fleece, and the fleece is to give the bag a bit of structure and make it kind of squishy and feel nice and help it to keep its shape. So I've cut two main body pieces and one flap piece out of this really old bit of fleece that I had left over. I think actually it used to be an IKEA blanket at one point. You're also going to need to choose some Rickrack, so I've gone for this really pale blue, which I think goes really nicely with the swans, and some sort of fastening for the front flap. So you could use a button, you could use a sew-on snap, you could use a magnetic clasp, but I'm going to go for prim snaps. So in order to use those, I'm going to need my prim pliers and a male and a female snap, and I'll show you how to install those later. I've also got a pair of scissors. You can use pins or sewing clips. I quite like these clips for this project. I've got a nice brand new needle in my sewing machine, some matching thread and a nice full bobbin, and we're all set to go. So step number one is to attach the Rickrack to the edge of the flap. So I'm going to do that, leave a little tail at the top. I'm going to use my sewing clips for this. Try and get the Rickrack to line up with the edge of the fabric. And then what I've done is I've put myself a zip foot on my sewing machine so I can really get close up. So what we're doing here is actually just tacking it on so that we can go ahead and sandwich all the layers together. And when we turn it out, it will be popping out from the edge of the pocket. Not pocket, the flap, you know what I meant. So all the way around the edge of this, we're going to pop this Rickrack. And I'm going to find it hard to show you guys the actual sewing process because, believe it or not, getting these tutorials, getting the camera angles and things right so you can see, it's quite tricky. So what I'm going to do, now that I've got that attached nicely, is I'm going to pop over to my sewing machine and I'm going to run a line of stitches really close to this outer edge, just catching the edge of the Rickrack so that we can move on to step 2. Right, so we're back from the sewing machine. I will show this up close to you. Can you see that I've put a really small line of stitches right around the outside of that Rickrack just to hold it in place, and that's because I don't want it to move when I sandwich the flap layers together. If you find that really tricky to do, you could use a little bit of Wonder Tape, or you could hand baste that Rickrack in place and then just remove your basting stitches afterwards. But like I said, I have used a zip foot and I've just sewn and caught the edge of that Rickrack around the outside of the flap just so I know it's not going to move. The next step is to layer up the flap pieces. So you're going to need your flap lining and you're going to pop that down right sides together on top of the flap piece that you've just sewn, trying to get everything nice and neat. And then you're going to take your wadding or fleece or whatever you've chosen to make this bag nice and squishy, and you're going to pop that on top of there. And so with all those edges even, just use some clips or pins just to secure that all the way around. Okay, and then we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and then using a fairly small seam allowance, I'm going to sew all the way around the outside of this flap piece. So if you chose Rickrack that had bigger waves on it, you probably wouldn't want to get quite so close to the edge, but because my Rickrack is quite skinny, I'm going to use a very small seam allowance just to sew all the way around the outside of the flap piece. So when that's done, I'll bring it back and we'll turn it inside out. Okay, so you can see that I have sewn really close to the edge here, and I've done that because I want as much of that Rickrack to poke out as possible. And the next step is to turn this flap the right way round. So in between the lining and the outer, turn it right the way round. And we're going to pop over to the ironing board in a minute and give this a good press, but you can see that you've got some nice Rickrack sticking out from the edges of this flap, so you can see that there. Once I've ironed it, it'll be a bit more obvious. So I'm going to pop to the ironing board and then just give that a quick press. Okay, there you can see I've given a nice good press now so that all my Rickrack's coming out from this edge. It's really pretty, and inevitably you're going to get some movement of that fleece inside. Do you see how it doesn't line up anymore? The fabric lines up but the fleece has moved slightly, so I'm just going to go ahead and just trim that bit of fleece down so that when I come to attach the flap I can get it nice and accurate. So that's a bit better. The next step is to take your outer bag, and with right sides together, it's really hard to tell with denim. I think, don't think it matters much. Right sides together, you're going to put your two pieces of bag on top of one another and then pop the fleece on the top. Make sure to line it all up nicely. And then we're going to just use these clips again, or pins, just to fix the top. So we're going to sew along the top of this bag now, so make sure you've got all the edges even. You can of course tack this if you'd rather, so it doesn't move about so much. We're going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew all the way from this edge to this edge, nice and close again like I did with the flap. So here we go, I have sewn all the way along this top edge of this bag piece, and I then took it to the ironing board and ironed it really nice and flat so that this is a nice crisp edge at the top of the bag. So this is going to be the front of the bag. The back of the bag has a flap attached to it, and that kind of takes a bit of getting your head around, so I'm going to show you to the best of my ability how to visualise putting the rest of this bag together. So getting your head round how a bag works is the hardest part, because I can tell you I made at least 2 versions of this makeup bag when I first started out, and I ended up with the lining on the outside and the flap the wrong way round. So I found this the easiest way to sort of try and visualise what it's going to look like when it's done. So this is going to be the lining of my flap. This is going to be the back of the bag, and then obviously this is the lining of the bag. And what we're going to try and do is sandwich that flap in between those 2 layers, so that when we sew it all together, we're going to end up with the flap being the back of the bag, the swans on the inside with the swans on the inside of the flap, and then this part of the bag is going to be attached like that. Okay? It's kind of hard to get your head round, and I have to think twice about it, but if you pop your flap on with the lining facing up and then sandwich this in between, and then pop your fleece on top and sew along this edge, we should all be in the right arrangement for the bag, hopefully. So I'm going to really try hard to get this flap in exactly the right place, and the way I'm going to do that is I am just going to use a ruler, and I'm going to mark the middle of the flap piece, and then I'm going to mark the middle of the bag piece, and I'm going to line those 2 pins up so that I get this flap in exactly the right spot. So I'm just going to grab a ruler. Here we are, back again. So we're looking at the bag top about 8 inches. So I'm going to stick a pin in at 4, and then the bag flap is about 6, so I'm going to stick the pin in at 3, and then I am going to line my 2 pins up like that, so that we are absolutely in the right place. So what I tend to do at this point is to stick a couple of pins into my flap to attach it to the bag. Like that, can you see? So that it's not going to move around. You could put another couple up here, or if you wanted to be really accurate, you could use tacking stitches along the top here just to keep this really, really still, so that you end up with a nice neat finish and your flap in exactly the right spot. So the next thing to do is to pop the lining piece, oh, there's threads everywhere, right sides together on top, get it nice and lined up, and then the last thing you need is your piece of fleece. So we're going to line that up, and I find the easiest way to do that is just to take 1 layer at a time, line them up, and pop the clips in again. So if you do both edges, like that, then just making sure you've got all your raw edges nice and even there. Okay, nearly there. Oh, I've run out of clips there by the sewing machine, but you get the idea. I'm now going to sew all the way along here and catch that flap into position. Okay, so as you can see, I've gone ahead and sewn all the way along the top of this bag now. I did actually switch to pins when I got to the sewing machine because I found pins actually stop it slipping quite so much as the clips do, and you've got quite a lot of layers there to sew. And of course, like I said before, if you find this bit tricky, use a bigger seam allowance. Just use the edge of your presser foot to go along that line there. So now we're going to reveal what the bag's going to look like. So this is the back of the bag. This is the flap that's going to come over the front of the bag. And it can be useful just to align the pieces just so you can visualize what it's going to look like. So we've got all our pieces right now. I'm going to pop to the ironing board and give this a really good press along here so that it's all nice and neat. So I'm just going to pop off and do that. Here we are then, all ironed nice and flat. And then the last piece of the construction, which is the really fun bit, is bringing the bag together. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and visualize how the bag's going to look. And the easiest way to figure out how to sew these pieces together is to lay them like this. Okay, so you can see we've got the flap, we've got the outside of the bag, and we have the fleece and then the lining of the bag. So we're going to want to attach the fleece and the outside of the bag together. So to do that, we're going to pick up those two layers and flip it over to these two layers over here. And then we're going to flip the whole bag like this. Okay, this does mess with your head if you've never made a bag before. But I find that method the easiest way to visualize how to sew the layers together. So what you're going to do now is you're going to line the lining up really nicely, and you're going to line the outer up really nicely. And I should just say that if you're reading the instructions in the book, Saskia does tell you to top stitch before you do this, right the way along those top edges where we just sewed. So let me just show you. I'll just undo the bag again. So she does say to top stitch all the way along here and all the way along here, but I don't like the way that looks when you put the bag together. I prefer to top stitch this whole area as one, so I skip that step and do it later on. So fleece, outer, outer, fleece, lining. So it's really important at this point that you're going to want to layer all these layers up really, really accurately so that you can, and I like to use pins here, so I'm just going to lean over and get my pins so that you can sew round without anything moving. So pop some pins in, line up your little, so these little notches here, these little cut out pieces are going to form the shape of the bag when we sew them up. So I am going to line up those pieces first. Make sure they're nice and even. So put the bag outer together. Put the fleece together. And then pop a pin in. And then carry on doing that. So making sure that you're getting your outer pieces and your fleece pieces lined up really accurately. Go ahead and do that right the way round the outside of the bag, and I'll pop back when I've done that. So here we have the bag all pinned together, and I make sure when you do this that you get this edge here where the top of the bag is really nice and lined up. You see I popped a pin either side exactly in the spot. Can you see that? Where the bag is going to be meeting at the top there. And we're going to turn this bag through the lining, so what we need to do is to leave a gap for turning through at the bottom here. So I've popped 2 pins either side. I'm going to use my sewing machine, and I'm going to use a slightly bigger seam allowance this time. So because you've got lots and lots of layers here, I'm going to use the edge of my presser foot to make sure I can catch everything in. I'm going to start here, and I'm going to sew along to here and back stitch, and then I'm going to start here and sew along to here, and then when I get to here I'm going to just pivot slightly and carry on round here and stop, and then sew along here and stop, sew along here, pivot right the way round, stop, and then to here and stop the other side of this opening. So we will be essentially leaving a small gap here for turning the bag through. Actually might make that gap just a tiny bit bigger. There we go. So I'm going to pop over to the sewing machine now, starting here, and like I said, miss out the little triangles and sew right the way around the edge of the bag. There we go. Sewn all round, left a little gap for turning through. Kept all the nice edges nice and neat and even all the way around, so hopefully it'll be as neat as it can be when I turn it around the right way. The next thing to do, after you've trimmed off all your threads, because there's lots of them, is to make the shaping for the bag. So that involves grabbing these little triangles and pulling them apart. So you see that? When you pull the triangle apart, you can line up the raw edges, line up the seam, hope you can see that there, and then pop one to one side and one to the other side, making sure that it's nice and lined up. And then using a pin, I normally just pop a pin right down the middle of that where they're lined up and then line the rest of the raw edges up like that. Make sure it's nice. They might not line up exactly, but that's pretty nice and neat there. So just to show you again on this corner, take the notch bit, grab the lining and pull it outwards. This is kind of tricky. There we go. So once you've pulled it outwards, then line that seam up there so that they're in exactly the right place, and push one way and one the other. Pop a pin right down the middle of there so it's nice and lined up, and then just line up your raw edges. And pop a pin in either side there. So what we're going to do now is to take this to the sewing machine, and we're just going to sew all the way along that edge there on all of those areas. So obviously with these ones you've got double layer, so you're going to want to just be cautious, make sure you get that looking really nice and neat. And if your sewing machine is struggling a bit, a walking foot's really a good tool to have for making bags, I've found. Not that I'm an expert on making bags, but a walking foot does make life a bit easier, especially if you've got lots of layers. It kind of feeds it through at the same speed. Or like I said earlier, if you're finding it difficult to keep everything in place, just use a needle and thread and hand stitch that before you then machine stitch, and then you can unpick your tacking stitches afterwards. So I'm going to pop across to the sewing machine and sew all those corners up. We're nearly there. Okay, we're nearly there. Here comes the fun bit in a minute, but first of all we're going to go round and just snip off all the loose threads to make sure this is a nice and neat project. So just pop all those threads off with a pair of scissors. Any more? Nope. And I'll just show you those corners here, look. So can you see how I've sewn across there? I've just slightly pivoted at the top. Now, moment of truth is birthing the bag. What we're going to do is we're going to reach inside and turn it all through this hole we've left. And this can be a bit of a tricky process if you don't leave a big enough hole. So make sure you leave a big enough hole. We're going to pull it all the way through. And this is at the point where you might think, oh no, what have I done? It's all back to front. But don't worry, because once we finish poking all these bits out to make them nice and neat, then we're going to pop the lining back inside. So you can see it's all exactly as intended. Perfect. So what I'm going to do to begin with is just pop my hand inside there and just make sure I've really pushed these corners out. You could trim those seam allowances down a little bit if they're a bit bulky, just to get the best corners on there. Mine's looking okay. Give it a good finger press out, make sure it's all turned out really, really well. Do the same with the lining pieces. They're going to be pushed in the other way. That's a loose thread there. So now that you've got, what you're going to do is sew up this hole, because we don't want that in the bottom of our bag. So the best way to do that, and it's entirely up to you, if you want to machine stitch that shut, you can, but I really like a nice neat finish, so I'm going to go ahead and hand sew that little gap shut so that it's invisible. And the best way to do that is to hold the lining, tuck the edges in, get the edges nice and even like that. And then I usually just pop a little pin in the middle, keep it nice and still. And then I'm going to take a needle and thread and then just slip stitch this gap shut so that it's no longer visible. Right, we're almost there, guys. It's nearly finished. It's exciting. So the last thing we need to do is to poke this lining down inside the bag, and you can get your hands right in there and give it a good push out like that so that the lining is sitting nicely inside the bag. You might find that it's not quite exactly the same size, but you know what? It's pretty good. And then I was talking to you about this top stitching business before. I then like to go along and then top stitch all the way around this edge here, so that you don't have a mismatched set of lines of stitching. It's really difficult to show you because it's kind of dark fabric, but if you had top stitched these areas prior to putting the bag together, you might find that they don't quite line up there, and I don't like that look. So I'm going to go ahead now, take this to my sewing machine, and then just go right the way round the edge of this bag, top stitching close to the edge, just to hold all the layers and give it a really neat opening. So I've taken the little box bit off the front to give me a bit more space here so that I can pop the arm of the sewing machine inside the bag. And this is what I'm talking about with the top stitching. Can you see that little line there that's on this foot? I'm lining that up with the edge of my bag and then just stitching all the way along really neatly. And you do sometimes have to give it a gentle pull from behind because it's stitching through quite a few layers there. But yeah, keep going all the way around till you finish top stitching that down. Righto, all done. Hope you can see there's a line of top stitching right the way around now, and I matched my bobbin thread to the inside of the bag so it looks nice and neat. And the very last job that we've got is to put our fastening on. So get your bag nice and square, flap the flap over, and decide where you're going to put it. So I use a quilting ruler to do this, and I'll show you how. Let me just grab it. So this is my quilting ruler. It's going to be kind of hard to see, but it's got lots of lines on it, and I'm going to use these lines to line up on my flap so that I can get my popper in exactly the right spot. So I'm going to go with about there, I think. So I've lined this line up here with the front of my flap, and I can see that that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 inches. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to pop a spot using a chalk pen on the flap. Not showing up very well. I'll have to lick it a bit. There we go. So I've got a little spot on there, and then I'm just going to eyeball it as well. So make sure your bag's nice and square, pop the flap down, and then just have a look at it just to see whether or not you feel like that does look like it's in the middle of the flap. And yeah, I think that's pretty good. So the next thing to do is to mark on the underside of the bag where that popper's going to go. So I tend to like to get the bag looking like it's nice and straight, like that, and then use a pin, and then pop your pin through the hole that you've already made, through the marking, and then lift the flap up on the pin, and then pop a little marking on the underside here. Give the chalk a little lick, so I know where to put the snap on the side of the bag. So we're going to move on to the snaps now. This is the scary bit because you've just spent ages making this beautiful bag and now I've got to poke a hole in it. This is the bit probably that's the most nerve-wracking, like when you're putting buttonholes into a garment that you've made. What you want to do is you want to grab your pliers, you want to grab your pointy bit of your snap, and you're going to pop that through the bag where you've marked the hole. And sometimes that can be kind of difficult to do because we've got lots of layers there. So I do sometimes use a seam ripper really carefully to make that hole just a tiny bit bigger. And then pop your snap through the hole you've made so that the pointy bit is sticking out on the other side. Now I tend to put the male popper, I hope you can see that sticking through there. I tend to put the male popper on the outside so that I can press it into the female one. And the male one, if you can tell, has, I'm going to bring it a bit closer, has a sticky up bit. You can probably guess why it's called the male one. And the female one is much flatter. So we're going to go ahead, pop the male one on top like that. So can you see? Like that. Then using the prim pliers, which has got a little plastic bung on it, I'm going to pop the cup at the back of the prim pliers onto the cup, onto the back of the pointy bit, like this, so that the squashy bit's touching on the inside. And then I'm going to move my hands right to the ends of the pliers because you'll get the most amount of pressure if you do that, and then just squeeze the bejesus out of that. Okay, so there we have one popper, and I like to just make sure a couple of times that it's really firmly attached, because these snaps have caused me problems in the past, ripping out of garments and things. So just to make sure that's really nicely attached there, and it is. So with this one, we're going to need to pop the pointy bit from the inside out. So again, I'm going to make a little hole with a seam ripper, just really carefully. And then with the seam ripper still in there so I can see where that hole is, I'm going to go ahead and poke that pointy bit through. It's kind of tough with denim, you give it a good wiggle. It's just starting to pop out now. Okay, almost there. Right, so I've got that sticking out through the fabric, And then I'm going to put my female bit on the top, like that. And then this bit's kind of tricky because the bag's quite fat. Gather the bag up, pop your pin pliers on the back, make sure that cup is right over that snap, and then move your hands to the end of the pliers and give it a really good squeeze. And then, just for good luck, oh, I lost the seam ripper now, I'm going to just do it again. You can use a table to get you a bit more leverage. Okay, we're in. Then just give it a little couple of snaps, because to begin with they're kind of tough. So you need to snap and unsnap a few times just to... There we go. So we'll pop that back up shut and you can see your finished bag. How cute is that? It's all done. Brilliant. So I hope you enjoyed that and it's given you the inspiration to make yourself one of these lovely little makeup bags. If you would like to win this makeup bag that I made today, please like and subscribe and leave me a comment below telling me why you love sewing, and I will pick a winner at random and then post this off to you in the post. I'm also offering, if you would like to have your initials or a message of your choice ironed on with vinyl on the front there with my Cricut machine. So yeah, that's it for today, everybody. Follow me on Instagram at SewPrettyKitty, and if you make one of these makeup bags and you want me to see it, please tag me or use the hashtag SewPKBag, and then I'll be able to see them all. I'll pop all the details in the comment box below. My next video may be a little delayed. It's half term next week, so I don't know whether I'm going to get much time, but I have got some sewing projects that I have finished, so there are some things to show you for May. And then, of course, we'll be planning what to do in June. I can't believe how quickly this year is disappearing. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye!